Okay, so like we mentioned before, we're going to be talking about sport and legislation. In particular today, we're going to be focusing on Title IX, in particular, gender equity, all right, opportunities in sport in particular. Got to remember that there were some watershed rulings in recent history. In 1996, decision for co-education, for example, to make Virginia Military Institute a co-ed institutional environment was ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. And also then in May 2016, there were guidance from the Department of Education clarifying rights for, in particular, transgendered and the LGBTQ community, which has since been rescinded by the Obama administration implemented that, and then the Trump administration rescinded that. But those are still some really important recent decisions. We're going to get into some of that in part because we're going to go through some of these slides fairly quickly. But obviously, all of this legislation is based on the 14th Amendment and under the auspices of equal protection. And remember, standards of review, which we've talked about before. The three different classifications: strict scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, and rational basis of review are the three different types of scrutiny that the courts will use to determine how closely they'll look at a case. Remember, strict scrutiny tends to have the highest level of review from the courts, and in order to implement a rule or discriminate, I guess you could say, the government needs to show that the challenged rule or practice is necessary to achieve a compelling governmental interest. Now remember, gender equity issues have risen from intermediate scrutiny to, especially in particular as these two watershed court cases in 1996 and in 2016, the idea the gender-based decisions have moved from intermediate scrutiny to, in many cases, the strict scrutiny category. All right? So I'm going to continue. We've talked about this already before, so you can look at those at yourself. Now, so when we come to Title IX, Title IX comes to us from the Education Amendments of 1972, and Title IX specifically says, no person in the United States shall be, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in or denied benefits or subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal aid. So there are three key elements in that governs or directs Title IX: gender discrimination, federal funding, and that it is an educational program. Although, again, some of the reach of Title IX has really increased in recent history. Okay, so the office that is in control of enforcing Title IX is called the Office of Civil Rights. There are three primary areas that determine whether or not an institution that receives government aid falls under compliance. So, first of all, athletic financial assistance, accommodation of interests and abilities, and program areas. So now we're getting into really targeted, more sport-specific areas in which whether or not an institution comes into compliance. All right, and these are the three primary areas in which is required. So financial assistance must be awarded on the basis of the number of male and females. All right, athletes. The test is financial proportionality. It's huge. The total amount of athletic aid must be substantially proportionate to the ratio of male and female athletes. All right? The selection of sports and level of competition must effectively accommodate the student's interests and abilities. Therefore, if there are significantly more female students and they are interested and they have the means of desire to want to create a team for their maybe a field hockey team that they don't have, but there's a lot of interest for it, they may have some standing to proceed. So here's the, it's a three-prong analysis for whether or not an institution has maintained compliance through accommodation. So participation opportunities are provided in a number of steps. If the school is within proportionality, they remain in compliance. If they have a history of continuing program, because remember when Title IX was first implemented in 1972, many schools did not have any sports at all for females, for women. And therefore there had to be this part of history of continuing practice of program expansion. The government understood, and most institutions understood, that if there was one pie of finances, and in the beginning when that pie was fully allocated only for male participation or very few female participations, then there had to be a program, a time period of expansion in which schools could show and prove that they had slowly were improving the status of and the opportunities really availed to women to participate in sport. And finally, that the interests and abilities of the members of that sex were fully and effectively accommodated by the present program. So if you had some female athletes that wanted to play field hockey, but it wasn't legitimate, or there weren't enough, or there weren't, maybe you only had 2 girls that could play field hockey, and there weren't enough, obviously a program wouldn't have to establish a field hockey team. But as more and more interest came, then there would be a growing need for expansion. Other areas that need to be implemented or understood is also Title IX looked at equipment and supplies, scheduling and practice games times, and so on and so forth. For example, if you had a men's team and a women's team, and there was a stadium, both teams would have to have access to that stadium or practice facilities. You couldn't put the women off somewhere in some far off area where they didn't know, where no one knew where it was, and the ground was terrible or the facility was terrible. There had to be some expansion of facilities. Travel and per diem allowances. You couldn't, for example, have your football team get $20 per diem allowances and then give your women's volleyball team $5 allowances. Opportunity to receive academic tutoring, opportunity to receive coaching, assignment, and compensation. Having access to qualified coaches is another important aspect. All right, locker rooms, practice, competitive facilities, medical and training facilities. All of these were really, really important. And as a female coach myself, I'm a product of this process, because when I was hired in 1999 to take on the women's program really only had 2 scholarships. All the uniforms were men's jerseys, old men's jerseys, and quite frankly, I didn't complain at first, and we didn't really complain. We just did our business and went on. But over time, as we started realizing that other teams could afford or had these benefits that the women's team didn't have, it was one ask at a time. Hey, we understand that men's soccer has 7 scholarships and we only have 2. We should have more scholarships. And we slowly built the program, and really on the heels of this type of legislation called Title IX. I hope this is enlightening, and if you're ever in a situation where you're coaching a female team, or you're a female coach and you're trying to figure out, well, how do I get equal access or equal opportunity? You don't have to be belligerent in order to get some of this, but I would suggest that invoking the idea of Title IX to bring equality for your programs is helpful. And you also have to have some understanding, because again, every school, every place has one pool of resources in which they're trying to manage. Money doesn't miraculously show up in order to fund your programs. You got to figure out with the school over time how to meet those resources and meet those needs and desires of those students who are wanting to participate. I hope this is enlightening. We'll talk more tomorrow about sexual harassment under Title IX.